you, and welcome to this talk called From Legacy Chaos to the Promised Land of Domain-Driven Design. And thank you to Paul and the Explore DDD organizers for creating this event and letting us be a part of it. So, I'm Ellen. I've been a software developer for about 20 years. I fell in love with domain-driven design about 10 years ago. And 5 years later, behavior-driven development came sneaking into my life, and I've been really passionate about both of them ever since. I work at Headshed, a startup company in Norway creating intelligent sales software. And I also worked at Statoil with Anita.
Yeah, so I am Anita. I have also been working with software design for more than 20 years. I have a technical education, and I always like to code, but my real passion is usability or user experience. I read the famous book about DDD around 2004, and it made sense to me from the start. But it was first when I, some years ago, jumped back into coding again that I really fell in love with it.
So, our story. For the last 2 years now, we have been working on gradually modernizing a large and complex business-critical application in Statoil. The application is about 20 years old and a real giant. So we wanted to use ideas from domain-driven design and behavior-driven development to rewrite this giant piece by piece until we reached its promised land of DDD. It has been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but also a lot of fun. So now we want to share with you some of the experiences we have had so far along the way, both the sunny parts and the rainy parts.
Yeah, and to give a bit of a background, since this is a project run in Statoil, I will briefly tell you a bit about Statoil. It's a multinational energy solution company with more than 21,000 employees, and it has its headquarters in Norway. It's the world's largest offshore operator, and it has really a special role that only Statoil has, in that it needs to also sell the gas shares owned by the government, and it's the second largest gas exporter to Europe. The recent year, it has also taken the first step into working with new energy solutions, and it's the major owner of the world's first floating wind farm park. So that was Statoil, and the solution we are talking about here today is called Energy Bus. It has its core related to gas sales, and it can be divided into two parts. The one is invoicing focused. It takes all the quantities of gas and it classifies it, and based on a set of secret rules, it does that classification, and based on information about the price, it makes the invoices. This sounds as boring, so simple that it's boring and not a DDD thing to do, but I can promise you that the rules in the heart of the gas sales agreements are nothing but boring. And it also covers all kinds of contracts related to the cost side, like transportation, storage, and things like that. On the other part of the solution is more focus related to financial services. It makes the detailed transactions to be sent to Statoil's central accounting solution. And here the rules around the quantities are just as important as the amount, because we need to be able to prove that no gas has disappeared on the way. And then, as I mentioned, this special role that it sells the gas for the government means that it needs to split both the income and the cost correctly between Statoil and the Norwegian government, and there is a lot of functionality around that in this financial services. The first line of code for this solution was written back in 1993. Just take a minute to think about that. That's a long time ago. And Eric said in his keynote yesterday, you should hope one day you become a legacy. Well, we did it. We made it. Absolutely. And around year 2000, we did a renewal of the user interface, got rid of a terminal-based user interface, and replaced it with Visual Basic screens in a graphical user interface. And the strategy back then, when it comes to the server side, was kind of, the server is working, don't touch it, don't you dare to touch it. So it was no enhancement of the server side in 2000. Well, so as I said, the first line of code was written in 1993, and believe it or not, some of these lines of code are still there, out there running and giving valuable functionality for our users. And that's a long, long time ago. My teenage daughter back home wasn't even born then. So what started out as this cute angel guiding our users in their work has been constantly enhanced during all these years and become a huge giant. But it is still a valuable solution for the business. It has been able to adapt to the changes in the business need. So meaning that even though it's a lot of technical legacy here, for the user, it's quite a good solution today, even before we started this journey. And the way we have done this, of course, is just to add and add on functionality all the way. So the service side has become huge. And in addition, this legacy solution was written in a language called Gen. It's a fourth generation language where you generate C code underneath, but the way you write it is really tightly coupled with the database. It's so coupled that the way you write code is to select from menus that provide you with option to choose from. So you can think it's not easy to restructure that code. So refactoring wasn't a thing we were thinking about or working with until C# came along, which is the new language we use on the server side today. And of course, this is from the 1990s. So we were so good in reusing code. We were excellent in that, meaning that some small function is kind of used all over the solution. So if you change one of them, you have to regenerate everything and retest it. And sorry, I didn't mention that. No automatically test coverage here, meaning that we have a test demand for regression testing that is quite huge. Sorry, trying to take the time here, and it's, yeah, try to don't think about that. Okay, so the regression test has really high test demand, but on the good side, when our story starts, we already decided to use DDD, so we didn't need to take that fight. We had a team with person that had been working in the area for years, knowing the business very well, sometimes better in the than the business people in some area, and they cooperated in a good manner. And we needed that because there is a lot of islands out there, islands of functionality only known by one or two person, and they are the only one that actually can change it. And of course, we did more upfront design. And upfront design means you have to have this handover, and handover doesn't always work well. But being quite good in upfront design, having this team that work well together, we managed to deliver about 2 main deliveries every year. And for each delivery, it was 2 weeks, and I mean it 2 weeks, and sometimes we were 20 person with regression testing. And when the team has done that, it was 2 weeks for the business to do the regression testing. For me, that was the most boring part of the year, just testing, testing, testing. But you got to do what you got to do, and this testing made us actually able to be in control even in the legacy landscape. So wait a moment, why do we talk about this legacy chaos? We managed, the user was quite happy, and the team managed to deliver. Well, when you have this island of functionality known by 1 or 2 persons, and then it comes a demand that every member in the team should be cross-functional and be able to code, and there were no automatically tests, as I said, and you have these 2 yearly main deliveries, and the demand is that you should deliver very often. Well, then the feeling of the chaos appears. But with this feeling, that is something good up here too, because you understand that what has been working in the past will not necessarily work in the future. And we were lucky because a project came along, a transition project, with the scope of taking this server side of the financial server part of the solution and enhance that to rewrite it from the Gen language to C#, and at the same time make a more modular solution. And with project, there come fundings, and with fundings, there is opportunity. So we had the opportunity, but how to manage to go there with a team with not much experience in DDD and BDD, but knowing the business quite well?
That's when I came in. I came in as a lead developer to this team about 2 years ago. And in the beginning, I thought that my main role was to lay out the new architecture and design for the others to follow. So that's what I did. I just kind of told everyone how I wanted the new code to look like. And they said yes and went to their desk to do their job. But when I looked at that code afterwards and the design, it wasn't really what I thought I had explained. So I soon discovered that changing software design, changing code, isn't really about changing software and code. It is about the people. It's about the individuals and interactions. It's about helping team members to change habits, to mentor and teach new skills, but most of all to walk the line together, doing the change process together as a team. Changing people is a lot harder than changing code, but also a lot more interesting. I learned so much about people, my team members, during this project. I learned how very different they are when it comes to personalities and preferences in learning. So, for instance, one of the team members liked to be told in quite detail what to do, especially for new stuff. And she enjoyed having a more experienced programmer sitting next to her while doing it. Another person would rather try out the new things by herself. And if I did the same to her, like sit next to her, she would get stressed. She wanted to do it by herself. What she did like, though, was to have someone to look over her code afterwards, giving her tips on what she could have done differently and why. And again, when I did this to another team member, giving him tips afterwards, he got really mad and felt that I was just criticizing all what he had done. So what he preferred was more upfront discussions. And then he wanted to be trusted that he would write the code in a good way. So I had to learn all these things about the team members. And I did some mistakes on the way. I hurt other people's feelings, and my feelings got hurt. But eventually, as a team, we discovered these things about each other, and we learned so much better how to work together and to utilize each other's strengths to become a great team. And I think also that, for me, this kind of relational learning and change was really the most inspiring about this project. Okay, so there were some challenges, and one of the main challenges for this team, I think, was to change from a data-centric view to a feature-centric view. A task that I often like to compare with that of changing from a geocentric view of the universe to a heliocentric view. So now nobody questions that it is the Earth that revolves around the sun. But when Copernicus introduced this idea in the 16th century, it took the population about 100 years to accept the fact that the Earth is not the center. So the mindshift change for this team did not take that long. But it might have been equally hard and painful, because they were used to a universe where the data was the center. The database was the truth and the starting point for everything. And now they had to shift their minds to think that it was more about the features and the behavior of the system. That was the starting point, and the data was kind of a side product. And that's not an easy shift to do. To help us in this process, I would like to thank Julie Lerman. I think she might be here somewhere. Her insight and articles about domain-driven design for the data-driven mind has been really helpful, both for giving us tips on how to do this change, but also helping me understand which parts of DDD are really hard when you're used to putting the data in the center. When it comes to learning, I strongly believe that you learn the best if you do it in different ways. If you hear it and read it and try it, and just try to use all your senses in the learning process. So, one of the things that we did was using Roleplay. We actually had the whole team play out a gas sales algorithm in 2 versions. First as a transaction script, and then using domain-driven design. Just to really feel the difference between these 2 coding styles. So all the team members were playing out a class with different responsibilities and knowledges, and they had to cooperate to fulfill the task of the algorithm. And this cooperation looked very different in these 2 scenarios. This was most for fun, of course, maybe a bit embarrassing for some, but also a little bit of learning. And I think, you know, when you have strong feelings like joy or embarrassment, that's when you remember. So, and Anita has told me that she still sometimes uses this experience to help her designing the classes that she is creating. We did other things too to increase the domain-driven design knowledge of the team. And one of the things that surprised me was that the people who grasped these ideas the first were not the most experienced programmers, but rather the more soft-skilled people, like Anita, for example. Which shows, again, that domain-driven design isn't a technical programming skill. It's a mindset thing, a mindset that will form your code in a certain way.
Yeah, and it's true. I sometimes use this role play, not just when I'm unsecure of how the class should be, but if I'm discussing with the other team members, just to make, and we are not agree upon it, I try to take the analog to what we did. So to say some words about my learning journey here. Well, as I said, I have a usability background. And as having this background, it was so easy to believe in DDD and its power. In the usability area, we had this model that stated if you manage to communicate a functionality in the screen through a model that is similar to the mental model of the users, you're more likely to get a usable solution. So for me, DDD is a bit usability for us that actually implement the solution. And we started out, since we were more than one person that needed to start coding again, the whole team was supposed to code, and some of us loaded and some didn't, but we started out in studio groups. And then we went on with more pair programming and mentoring. And for me, starting in this bonded context role, would automatically test someone to look out for you if you do some silly things. And having Ellen as a mentor and doing pair programming was a brilliant way to start. And I think for new team members, knowing, for instance, C# very well, but don't knowing the business, they also was able to contribute much faster. And of course, we needed to learn more about the business, all of us. So we had this workshop with the users and other meetings so they could, so we could understand their business. And then we did actually a lot of code reading. We read the code in a legacy solution. And why is that? Well, our users know their domain and they can verify a rule, but to list all the rules that has appeared the last 20-something years, that's kind of an impossible task. So we needed to use this legacy code just to extract all the requirements. And since we are working in this beautiful agile world, and I mean that it's beautiful because I come from the waterfall, and that isn't. So we could just take, I like this, to take just one feature at a time and not need to understand the complete solution. So we iterate, of course. And then we engage the whole team in the discussion around the bonded context. What should the responsibility be? Do we need a new bonded context here? What should the aggregate be? What's the naming? What language do we use in internal in this bonded context and so on. And we feel it's really valuable to use some time there and to engage all in this so everyone has something to say and everyone gets the feeling of how we want to design the solution. And then if we actually do something wrong here, we should just go back and do it right. On the other hand, when it comes to the detail design, the structure inside of bonded context, we had this onion architecture, and that guided the structure for us, together with feature tests that Ellen will talk more about later. So we didn't need to have all the discussions there. And of course, as I said, when we picked a requirement, we wrote one or more feature tests. And just to have this, to pick one of them and to implement it, and to make that work, I don't necessarily think about 100 other features just for that one calculation, because we have so many huge calculations. Felt so good. And this pattern of doing one, make it work, refactoring, I'm sure that's really known by you all, but for us, it was a completely different way of working than we had to do before, when we couldn't do refactoring, when we needed kind of to implement the whole calculation in one big bang. So for me, it was a bit of a light moment to understand that, okay, it is okay to take the feature one and to make some code even though you know this will not be your final design. And then you refactor, and you might even get a better code in the end by working that way, in the old way of trying to do everything perfect from the start.
Okay, so we did use domain-driven design and behavior-driven development. And for me, the two of these together is like dynamite. And I'll try to explain what I mean with that. It starts with testing. When it comes to automated testing, there are a lot of challenges. And even with the best intentions, it's easy to mess it up. Many people think that the more tests you write, the better. But when you do that, you get a lot of code, which also needs to be maintained, just like the production code. So my experience is that instead of helping, these tests just gets in my way when I want to refactor or extend the application. They make me feel stuck in the code, and I find that very frustrating. On the other hand, writing none or very few tests, which I'm sure none of you do, would of course make me very nervous when releasing. And I would not have the confidence to not do a lot of manual regression testing, which we find kind of tedious and boring. A type of test that I often see are tiny, tiny unit tests. And you can have 100% test coverage just by testing every unit completely and separately. It doesn't really make me less nervous, though, because how do I know that all these units work together the way they should? So maybe the answer is having huge integration tests, testing everything. Which brings me back to the feeling of being stuck with the code. I find it hard to change anything if all my tests depends on everything. And then you have mocks and mocking frameworks, which makes it easier to test parts of your system. I'll tell you a little secret about myself. I'm really scared of mocks. They make me feel that I have no control over what I'm testing. Is it the production code, or am I just testing the mock? I don't know. So, how to find a good balance for automated tests? In my opinion, a lot of people don't give this enough attention. And they end up randomly doing a little bit of everything, giving what I think is quite a messy test regime. It might look kind of like this. So if this is your application with the classes and modules, and you might have a test over there mocking out some parts of the system, another test mocking out some other parts, maybe a little unit test, another test in the middle, and so on. We thought about our test architecture, and it looks different. This is what we did, and I think it worked really well. Our test strategy was closely related to our bounded context. So this is where DDD meets BDD. So if this is one context and that's another one, and they communicate with each other through an anti-corruption layer, they also read and store data in the database through the repository. And at the top, you have the services exposing the features of the context. Our strategy was to put all our tests at the top only. We aimed at having no test in the middle here, except for maybe a few unit tests. And the only place we would mock out anything were at the border of the context. With this strategy, we got feature focus. All our tests were focusing on the actual features delivered by the system, the things that our users cared about. And we got complete test coverage within the context. We would describe every scenario, and all lines of code contributing to that scenario would be tested from the same point. No fakes, no mocks. So everything was tested. And this gave us more confidence than having lots of tests all over the place. They were not like huge integration tests, though, because we would cut them off at the border. So in that way, of course, we could, when we did changes in another context, they would not affect the test in this context. So we did have to write and use some mocks, but it was limited because they were all at the same place. And all the tests in one context would use the same mocks. And we tried to keep them simple. What I loved the most about this strategy, though, was that it enabled us to do all kinds of crazy refactoring. We had the feature test at the top, so we knew we didn't break anything. And also, since we didn't have any test in the middle, we didn't have to refactor any test code. Even if we did huge changes, it was still only the production code that we were changing. So in that way, it was easy for us to keep the code and design optimal with regards to changes in requirements, etc. But most of all, what happened? Oh, okay. Well, most of all, to be able to work with the code this way, to mold it and twist it and change it in every thinkable way, it's such a freedom. It's so powerful, and it makes me really happy while coding.
Yeah, Ellen, I guess you can actually talk about this the rest of the day.
Yeah, and the week.
A week or two or whenever, but we have to continue and to tell you a bit more about how did we manage to break the giant? Because the test we are talking about here is in one bonded context, but we needed to make them. So, splitting a giant monolith application, that's the easy part. You just carve out the correct pieces, and then you take each piece, and this is important, you have to throw it into the correct bonded context, because if you miss, it will be a disaster. But as long as you throw it into a correct bonded context, and this is DDD, everything will work. Of course not.
Easy.
Just kidding. I'm sure you all can imagine that this is hard, because we will not do a big bang here. So it's like if you renovate your house and you are living in it and you demand the same level of comfort during the complete process, then that is really hard to do. And the same is true here, because for every changes we needed the all application, all the screens to work, all the functionality to work. And that is a hard task, but we managed. And I will try to share some of that with you. So what we did was to design, okay, the rainy part. As we said, we have sunny parts and we have rainy parts. And the rainy parts for this we put in the database. We made the database the main integrator, meaning that the screens from the invoicing part that was not part of this project should still find the information in the same part of the database as they had done before. But still, the new bonded contexts are not allowed to kind of get the data from everywhere. So they have to follow the rules and play with them and only have their own data to read from. So we use this database as the integrator. And another thing that we used that was so good for us, I think, it managed to deliver code all the way to learn from what we did, was to exploit feature toggles. So I will share some of that with you too. If you are not familiar with feature toggle, you can compare it to a switch in a train station where you send the train to left or right, and you can switch it back and forth as many times as you want. This kind of switches we put in our code. So what we do, we had one scenario. We were implementing this calculation in bonded context A, and it was a huge calculation. As I said, we had so many of these huge calculations. And that calculation needed a small information from context B. It was a split number, just a percentage. And the plan was to do this together. But then the business started to discuss some new rules, how to calculate just that percentage. And they actually used about 2 months to decide upon that rule. But for us, it was quite easy to handle. We put a feature toggle in our context A, and we just used the old legacy solution, because sometimes it's quite handy to have a legacy solution with all the things there. So we should exploit it whenever needed. So we used the old legacy solution to provide us with this split figure. And we could concentrate with completing the calculation in the bonded context A and put that into production. And when they decided, after all this week, we implemented it in the bonded context B, and we could just use the switch. And I think also this is a mindset. When this situation appears, we never discuss, should we stop with the calculation now? Because we know we can do these kind of things, and it makes it easier to handle things that appear on the way. Another scenario, a lot of our calculation is actually triggered by the user from a user interface. So we put a feature toggle there when we start to implement a new calculation. And at first, that feature toggle make the legacy calculation to run, meaning that we could at any point in time actually put the new bonded context into production, even though there is a calculation there that is started but far from finished yet. And also, having these two calculations up and running in parallel, that's also the beauty of having this legacy solution. And we exploited that in many ways, I think. One thing was that we had all this data, so we made tests that compare the data that have been run with the old calculation with the data we run on the new calculation when we have finished it, and we compare it. And then we actually said, okay, it's hard to know if we have managed to fetch all the requirements, because as I said, we were reading legacy code. And this legacy code, we have some functions there, more than 3,000 lines, if then else for each, and they're calling sub-function all the time. So instead of using a lot of investment in actually being sure we have all the requirements, we just run this, when we have implemented all the requirements we knew about, we run this comparison, and each time it didn't be the same. We knew there were one rule we haven't picked up, so we picked it up and we implemented it. As you can see from this slide over here, we have multiple feature toggles. And the reason why we did that is because we tried to break things into smaller pieces. This was the calculation of a voucher. And when we calculate this for a cost contract, it only uses a subset of the total set of features. So we could have a switch for all the cost contracts. And then we implemented that part of the calculation, put that into production, and could get learning from that. And the next step was to enhance it with the feature for the gas sales calculation. And actually, there is people back home testing that part just as we are here speaking. So when they had tested, I said, that's OK, we will put that into production. So having this feature toggle make it possible to do that kind of arrangement too. And of course, can anyone guess the perfect fallback solution here? It's anyone? Yeah, it's just to use the feature toggle, which we haven't needed, but nevertheless, it's a good safety net to have, and we don't need to think about other parts of fallback. And just this voucher calculation, during the process of implementing this, we had this meeting with the users, and they say, okay, we have some enhancements we want. And the enhancement was related, they configure a template that described the information elements that should be calculated and sent to SAP, or the accounting solution. That is a simplification, but they make a template. So what we did, a new feature toggle. And first we could implement the template with the old functionality, and we make the calculation work for that. And that was the only thing we could compare with too, so we had to do it that way. And then we can enhance it with the new functionality in the template that they requested. And the good thing with that is that when we put this into production, it will not work until they have the time to actually do this and to configure the new template with the enhanced information. And our users as financial persons, so if they are in middle in a quarterly report, they haven't time to do those things. So we are more independent too. We could put it, they can test it, and if they agree upon it, we can put it into production, but not turning on the part that used the new template feature until they said, okay, we have finished setting this up in production now. So for us, having this feature toggle has really helped a lot with this taking bits and pieces and do one-on-one. So as I said, this step-by-step implementation has been really important, and being independent of the user availability. And of course, that is not something you want to do. You don't want to put anything into production that they are not ready to use. But if you have to, because they are busy, it's better for a team to be able to continue with a new calculation than actually sitting there and have a different code base from what you have in production. And since we are delivering so frequently, we are able to get continuous learning. So as said, I mentioned this enhancement of all the client side back in 2000. That was about a 2 years project and one big bang. Being able to take step by step, if you can do that, that is really highly recommended.
Yeah, so those were a lot of nice things that we have achieved. I agree on that. But I've been wondering, did we reach this promised land yet? I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so when doing this transformation, I wished for everything to be perfect, which it was. Not always. And maybe for me, one of the most important things that I learned in this project was this. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's still good. Every little improvement makes a difference. It doesn't have to be perfect. I keep telling myself that, and I think I'll learn it very, very soon. And there are, of course, hundreds of reasons for things not becoming perfect, and one of the reasons for us was that old habits are hard to change. So even if we knew the right way of doing things, we would occasionally fall back into the old way of doing things, like putting data in the center, putting all our code in the repository. We could go back and change this when we saw it. But sometimes we would just leave it there in this imperfect state, but we would learn from it and try to do better the next time. And this is good too. Another reason was that we were rewriting this application while still living in it, so we had to interact with the legacy code. And also, the energy boss domain, like many domains, is complex. And sometimes it was just really hard to find a perfect design, even for new stuff. This could be good, though, because it would give us hints about complex business rules. And sometimes instead of spending too much time on struggling to find this perfect design, we would go back and ask the users if they really needed this complex functionality. And very often the answer was no. So we could just remove the whole thing altogether. giving us a solution that was easier to use and understand for the users because they didn't have this complexity, and code that was easier to understand and use for the developers. So a lot of good things. Maybe we're seeing that promised land after all.
Yeah, it is correct. Everything isn't perfect, but it's so much better than it was before. It's just a better place to be. So in many ways, we have reached this promised land of DDD, I think. One thing is that more people know the code base now, simply because we have been working much more together. And if they don't know the code base for a bundle context, they can always get to know it, guided by the feature tests. And we have also seen that adding new functionality in the DDD world is so much easier than in our old legacy solution. So we have had some happy stories there, that things have been taken so less time than we had expected. And since we haven't done refactoring in the legacy world because we wasn't able to, every change becomes so hard. But here we could actually explore with our code, and we can refactor if needed. So that is one thing. And the best of all, we can deliver over and over again without these 4 weeks of boring testing period. I just love that part.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end here now. But what we want you to remember when leaving this room, to take from what we have said, is that it is possible to go from a situation with bad code to a situation with good code. But remember, it starts with the people, the mindsets. We believe that if you know your team members, their personalities, their learning preferences, their way of working together, that's when you can do great changes with your code. And when doing smart things with your code, will you not only increase the quality of the application, you will also increase the motivation of the team members, which in turn will lead to even better code. And with good code, you will be able to serve your users in a better way. So, thank you for listening to us. Yeah?
Just being curious, have you finished? Have you toggled out the last piece of the giants?
No, we haven't finished. The project that was launched is planned to finish this year or maybe January. And that will, of course, just take the financial services that is kind of the scope for the project, meaning that the invoicing part is not planned to be actually renewed at this time. So we will not do that part. So we are on the journey, just have learned quite a lot on the way, enough that we feel it's a good place to be. So that's true, we aren't finished.
Hi, so my question is, how did you do the slides? They're so beautiful.
Should we say the secret? That's thank you anyway. We have actually been drawing quite a bit ourselves.
That's really awesome. But I do have another question
Thank
as well. I do have another question as well. Did you lose any people in this transition?
Sorry?
Did you lose any people in the transition?
We lost me.
But that's the only people. The team consists of the same persons. We have two consultants, not three actually, in addition now. But none has, we haven't lost anyone without her.
Yeah.
That actually teaches us everything. So that's a bit sad.
Thank you.
But it's an interesting question, though, that I would like to dwell on a little bit, because I think also what we have seen, in my opinion at least, is that earlier, before we started this transition project, this team was not a place where a lot of people wanted to work. But now they do. They want to come to us or to you and work there.
That's true.
Again, great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So with around testing, I think that's probably most of it seems, it seems usual for a journey for companies to go to microservices. I appreciate the people aspect of it too that you talked about. But the testing one was what really, that's different. Because in our organization, we have the same deal where, okay, if our developers can't, because they're even new to the concept of even writing unit tests, they can't do that, let's just have them do BDD. And it's great for those who probably have done testing before, and then they see the value of, okay, this is more functional, it tells a better story. But we found it, those who started writing BDD were still very data-centric, and they were writing these BDD tests as if they were just testing the data. So I think there's a maturity process maybe to get, and then doing some automation testing, or first of all, I guess not thinking about the data, thinking about the business problem. You need that before you let loose and saying that you can do BDD, right?
I agree. And also that's where the people thing comes in. I think it has been, a lot of people have had to change their mind in this, and we couldn't have done that without knowing how to work together, because there's been a lot of working together to get there. But I would like to mention one of the people in the team that was really against testing in the beginning. He really didn't like it, and he really felt that it hindered his productivity. And he's now maybe one of the top advocates of this now. And that's really fun to see. So it's possible. But it requires a lot of mentoring and molding of people.
So we're at time. Thank you very much, Ellen and Anita. And will you be out here?
Yes.
Yes, we will. And
More questions? Thank you so very much.
thank you.